Right now, we turn our attention to U.S. infrastructure with Department of Transportation Secretary. Joining us, Pete Buttigieg. Thank you so much, Secretary Buttigieg, for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start, first of all, that balloon from China, which doesn't relate to transportation, but nonetheless is on the top of mind for everybody today. There's been criticism that President Biden didn't order that it be taken down just as soon as it was detected over U.S. airspace. Your thoughts on how the president chose to address this and have it shot down once it was off the East Coast?
Well, the president ordered for it to be brought down safely and left it to the military to determine the exact manner that would most responsibly achieve that. And that's exactly what the military did. They did a great job. I mean, from our perspective, as far as the Department of Transportation, our main concern was the safety of the national airspace. This balloon was at a very high altitude and larger than a school bus. A lot of equipment there in a debris field that when it did come down, was reportedly 7 miles long. And for that reason, needed to make sure that when an operation did take place, the FAA was coordinating with the Pentagon to make sure that all of our aviation assets and operations were safe. They did that and had to close down 3 airports and delayed a few dozen flights in order to make sure that everything was safe. But I think the most important thing is that this thing was brought down without any injury. Without any flights or people on the ground being damaged. And that reflects on the planning and the expertise and the precision of our military in dealing with this situation.
Based on what you've learned about this balloon, and now we have reports there might have been others over U.S. airspace in previous years, how much of this do you think is likely an actual intelligence gathering activity, and how much a judge of U.S. response once the balloon is detected?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any expertise on that. From what I've seen and the reporting that's been out there, we know this is happening in a context where countries spy on other countries. There's satellite and other intelligence gathering that happens all the time between a country like China and many others. So it's not strictly in terms only of the intelligence value that somebody looks at this thing. And I know there's a lot of speculation out there about what kind of testing or message might have been intended. Not really getting a clear answer right now from China. But we did get a clear answer from the president, which is that this was an unacceptable incursion. It was shot down for that reason, but done in a way that didn't harm any Americans or any flights.
Secretary Buttigieg, let's talk about traffic safety. We're seeing in many urban areas like Greater Los Angeles increasing numbers of pedestrian deaths, bicycles, pedestrians, cars, all jockeying for space. And one of the factors that we see, of course, is a great deal of distracted driving, walking, people not paying attention as they're doing this. I understand all the efforts to try and separate cars from bicycles and pedestrians, which are great. What more could the federal government do to try and address people being attentive to what they're doing when they're going from one place to another?
Well, no question, that's a big part of the issue right now. Look, we have a crisis on our roads. We got 40,000 road deaths per year, roughly, in this country. And part of what I think is so dangerous is that we've gotten used to it and have begun to treat it almost as if it were normal or inevitable. But it's really not. You can see by the examples we have from countries, and by the way, cities right here in the U.S., that have dramatically less roadway death. And we need to make sure we follow those examples of what works. That's why we're putting a lot of funding into this. Matter of fact, $800 million we just announced going to cities across the country in order to deal with this. Some of the things that affect whether somebody's paying close attention, part of it, of course, and ultimately it's a driver's responsibility, but the roadway design can also play an important role on that. It can also play an important role on speeds. And one of the biggest factors in so many of our fatal crashes does have to do with speed. So what we're working to do is support communities that are taking concrete steps to have roadway designs that are safer. And in this round of funding I just mentioned, just to give you a couple of examples, we supported an application from Los Angeles, California. They're getting about $21 million to help in an area that has had unusually high amount of car crashes in the Florence Firestone area.
Yeah.
And then in the city, we have a $9 million grant going to Los Angeles to deal with the opportunity to take about a mile of La Brea Avenue, turn it into what's called complete streets. It's where you set up the street to really encourage, let's call it, safe coexistence between pedestrians on the sidewalk and bicycles in bike lanes and vehicles on the road. And we know when we get that right, that helps not only with safety, but actually often helps small businesses too. So we're going to help continue helping to make sure the roads are designed well. We're going to push drivers to behave responsibly, and we're continuing to work on the design of cars. You know, we do things that a lot of people are familiar with, like the crash test dummies and the 5-star ratings. Some things people may not know about, like the work we're doing to evaluate the safety of these so-called advanced driver assistance systems, and make sure that as more and more technology comes into our cars, that leads to more safety and not less.
We're talking with U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg with us on Air Talk. While you were waiting to come on, you might have heard the BBC reporter talking about this devastating earthquake and aftershocks in Turkey and affecting Syria as well. We're, of course, in a major earthquake zone here in Southern California, actually throughout the state. And I wonder what the Department of Transportation has in the way of plans for when we are hit with a massive earthquake to be able to keep airports open, runways viable, so that search and rescue and aid can be able to come into California airports, for example, to keep freeways up. What are some of the things that the federal government is doing to assist in that project?
Well, I was just in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago to mark $400 million of federal funding going into a seismic retrofit of the Golden Gate Bridge. And that's because we know that there is a lot of vulnerability to earthquakes in that area. The Loma Prieta earthquake was an example. Obviously, the Golden Gate Bridge stood strong through that. But if the epicenter had been a little closer, we might have seen a different result. And so it's very important to shore up that bridge. That's one example of what it looks like to fund resilience improvements on infrastructure across the country. Everything from making sure that a road is better protected from mudslides or wildfires, to making sure that hurricane evacuation routes are strong. And that's certainly something we think a lot about when it comes to the seismic threat. Unlike the climate threat, the seismic threat is not something that we can control on the front end and do anything to change how likely an earthquake is to happen. But we can certainly do a lot to make sure that our infrastructure can get back up and running quickly. It's one of the reasons why we have this new resilience funding that was created by President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law. And we're going to keep working to deploy those resources, whether it's something like the bridge example I was giving, or it being a consideration recently when we funded an improvement on a corridor in Santa Cruz County, where we're going to take a part of SR1, which we know is not just a critical corridor, but also an evacuation route, and make sure that it's in good shape.
Yeah, so true. We're talking with U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Joining us on Air Talk. When we come back, we'll be talking with him about efforts to electrify our fleet of vehicles in this country, charging stations, what the federal government is doing there. There's also the continuing effort to electrify the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and the feds play a role in that. We'll get to it when we come back in 1 minute. Right now, we're talking with U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Joining us, of course, electric car sales are up, but still a fraction of vehicle sales. As part of fighting CO2 emissions, we want to see much more of electric cars in American driveways. Secretary, what is the U.S. government doing to enable the rapid construction of charging stations across the country?
Well, we're putting our money where our mouth is. Look, we know that the adoption of electric vehicles is accelerating. That's a good thing. We're doing our part to accelerate it. But it does mean that we're going to need to have the charging infrastructure to support that. And it's especially complex because, charging a vehicle is not quite the same as filling up with gas. It takes a different amount of time. It lasts a different amount of time. In some ways, charging a vehicle has more in common with charging your phone than it does filling up a car with gas, in the sense that you can often do it at work or at home if the right infrastructure is out there. We also need to make sure that there's a network of chargers across the country so that you never go more than 50 miles without knowing you're going to be able to find an electric vehicle charging station. Our approach to this has been to fund the states. So we have $7.5 billion that were part of the president's bipartisan infrastructure package. That's now set to go out to states and communities with a focus on creating that national network I was talking about, so that you know that even on the longest drive, you're going to have chargers. But also community work in places where it's not yet profitable for a private company to install a charger. But if we did have a charger in a certain area, imagine a multifamily building in a lower income area, for example, then that means you might reach some of the people who could theoretically stand to benefit the most from an EV and saving the money that comes with not having to buy gas, which is often lower income Americans.
Are you setting specific benchmarks for how many charging stations need to be online by a given time?
Well, the president's overall goal is 500,000 chargers in this country by the end of the decade. And we think we can hit that, but not without a lot of work and a lot of funding to make sure that they really get out there on a widespread basis. Right now it's really spotty. It depends where you are. Some places there are tons of chargers, but they might not be compatible with your particular vehicle. That's something that we're working on right now. We need to get to where this is as easy and as natural count on being able to do as part of your daily routine.
And as you said, the big challenge is apartment buildings where, may not be a case where the property owner is going to put in chargers. And so residents have to find another place to do it. I did want to ask you about the port complex of LA and Long Beach, the efforts there to electrify the truck fleet. What is the federal government doing to support that?
So this is an example of where we can really see a major improvement in air quality and an improvement in our supply chains at the same time. We're funding Long Beach with a $30 million grant to help them replace diesel yard tractors with about 60 electric yard tractors and get them the charging infrastructure they need, as well as software and other equipment. I was out on one of our visits. As you know, we pay a lot of attention to LA and Long Beach because that port complex is so important to America's supply chains. And I happened to be there on an unusually clear day where you could look out around the San Pedro Bay and see snow-capped mountain peaks that I didn't even know were there from the last few times I visited the region. That could be every day. And it's not just to have a pretty view, but the very real health impacts of having cleaner air, as well as, of course, the importance of staying a step ahead of climate change, all point to the need to help ports like LA and Long Beach that are moving in a cleaner direction. And we're going to keep working to help them upgrade the trucks and the landside vehicles. There are even ways to reduce the emissions coming in from the ships by making it possible for them to draw their power from the berth instead of running their engines while they're getting loaded and unloaded. All of these things add up to cleaner air and better health.
We're speaking with Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. Wanted to ask you about your political future. You moved to your husband's hometown in Michigan from Indiana, where you'd been. You've already said you're not going to pursue what will become an open Senate seat in Michigan. But President Biden is showing, even among his fellow Democrats, low enthusiasm for another run. If the president decides he's not going to run for a second term, will you decide to pursue the presidency?
I don't have any plans or designs right now on any job besides the one I've got. It's the honor of a lifetime that the president asked me to serve in this role in transportation, especially now when we're doing investments like we haven't seen since the Eisenhower years. And that's got 100%, 110% of my attention. But I'm definitely, obviously, very proud to support the efforts of this president and this administration doing a terrific job. He's going to be, and I'm looking forward to being there, giving the State of the Union address tomorrow night, reminding Americans of the extraordinary nature of the economic accomplishments, most jobs created by any president in 2 years, and then some. Low unemployment, lowest unemployment in about 50 years, even while inflation's coming down. We got to keep that up. We got to keep that going. And he'll be reminding Congress of some of the things that need to happen in order to keep that going. Well, I'm proud to be part of this team.
And of course, as you well know, the challenge is in Americans seeing it the same way. As we look at the polls, Americans don't see the economy as optimistically as you described it. But Secretary Buttigieg, thank you very much. Appreciate your being with us today on Air Talk.
Same here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg.